Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you are attending this session. With the law, it's something that we really are happy to provide in terms of capacity building, because this is something that is necessary. It's necessary for you to know about. It's necessary for you to be mindful of, because things change. And so while you're taking care of the community, it's really clear that we also have to take care of our organizations. And so we're really happy today to have extraordinary presenters, and we will be introducing them very shortly. So welcome, everybody, and let's get started. Shy? Okay. As we always do, we ask you to make sure that you have your full name and the name of your organization. That's in a way where we can identify you later. And that's why we make a big deal out of this, because if we want to connect with you later or know which session you attended, if you have done this little step for us, we're able to go back, and it really helps us in the future. So if you don't have your full name and the name of your organization so that we can link you to your organization, we want you to hover over your video, and you're going to see 3 dots in the right corner. You click those, and if you don't have that information in there, click rename, change your full name and your organization, and then you're all set. Next. Good morning, Buena Vista UMC. Okay, so there will be a recording, I promise, of this workshop, and it's going to be mailed out to all attendees. If for some reason you don't get it, you can always go to the website and see it yourself. These are private YouTube-based recordings. That's how this process is done. And so you will go into a modelbuiltonfaith.org if you don't receive it by email, and you will be able to get it. I want to say a special shout out to Kim Hill. Hi, Kim.
Hello.
Kim Hill is an amazing person. Can I tell them one thing about you, Kim?
Yes, you sure can. Hi, everyone.
Kim Hill is one of the students that we're working with. We're working with a group of students to develop them to become professional grant writers, so that when our nonprofit communities need a grant writer, we're developing a cadre of extraordinary intellectual people who are great writers that you will be able to call on. So we're developing them ourselves. We're raising our own crop of people. And I'm so excited about that Occur is providing this service and has this forethought to just look at the future and develop those folks that are behind us, knowing that as we continue in our work, we need good people to be able to help us write those proposals. That's really important to me. So I was really surprised that one of the people who showed up and is as one of my students last Saturday was Kim Hill. And then I did a little research on Kim Hill, and Kim Hill is one of the 4 original members of the Black Eyed Peas. Don't hide your face. You told me
I know you're going to say that.
That's what I was talking about. I'll say it again because they're going to say, what did she say? One of the, and Lady Sunrise knows, she's like, her face is about to crack. Her smile is so big. One of the original members of the Black Eyed Peas. And Kim is doing some extraordinary work in the community. And she's such a role model for young people. She's doing some extraordinary things, has a family of her own now, and she's doing her next career, which is so impressive. Next.
Thank you.
Okay. So you all know our team. We tell you about our team each time. Our fabulous, amazing president and CEO of Occur, Dr. David Franklin. And then I am the lead consultant with Occur, I'm also a member of the family. That's how I see myself, as a member of the family and a consultant and a co-founder of a model built on faith. And then the illustrious Michelle Miles Chambers, Dr. Chambers, Saron Stokes, who keeps things moving from the other side of the bay, Shy Alderman, and Simone Stokes. And then the person who tries to hide, Sandra Alexander. I'm just calling her out right now. So let's get started. Okay. Our speakers today are Karl Mill and Patrick Hogan. I'm going to introduce them at the same time, even though I haven't read the bios. I know Karl, I haven't read the written bio, but I want to do that so that I won't have to interrupt again. Prior to founding Mill Law Center, Karl Mill was a partner at Adler and Colvin, a boutique law firm serving nonprofits and their donors. Karl continues to advise a broad range of nonprofit organizations, including everything from the most innovative startups to some of the largest, most established foundations and charities around the country. Karl's philosophy is to apply his years as a lawyer and educator to provide clear, actionable legal advice and to support nonprofits. I love that word. Karl's areas of expertise include private foundations, public charities, impact investment, social enterprise, and charitable gift giving. Karl graduated from Columbia Law School in 2013 and practiced trust, estate, and tax law for several years at D.L.A. Piper. Please join me in giving a hand to Karl Mill. Karl is so generous with his expertise, and I just love Karl. Karl's going to be co-presenting with his colleague, also a member of the Mill Law Center, Patrick Hogan. Patrick is licensed in Ohio and Kentucky. He's a lawyer with significant nonprofit experience, residing in Kentucky. Well, right now he's not. He's residing in Cincinnati, Ohio, but he has served nonprofits for several years. He went to Chase Law School in 2013. He's a strategic business partner with a customer service mindset and the proven ability to collaborate and find solutions to resolve complex issues and overcome legal roadblocks in a timely and cost-effective manner. I will be checking in with them myself. In his free time, Patrick spends time with his wife and two young boys. And I think, Patrick, you can tell us how old they are. I remember they were under 10.
4 and 2.
4 and 2. So
Yeah, it's a lot.
he says that he's continually caffeinated. We were talking about coffee. He's always caffeinated. So if Patrick is talking real fast, that's what the problem is. He's had 5 cups of coffee to the rest of our 1. He enjoys traveling and is serving his 3rd term on the Bellevue City Council. So not only is he an attorney, but he's also out there working in the community. And I see one of our consultants has just come on, Michelle Edmond. Hello. And so let's get started. I'm handing it over to you, Karl and Patrick.
All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen. It's good to see everybody. This is always one of my favorite things to do each year. And so let me see if we get the screen sharing. Let me turn on the slideshow so it does what it's supposed to do. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to just get us started by talking through what we're going to try to cover. Big picture, the main goal here is for this to be useful and interesting to you. So please do any questions you have as we're going, put them in the chat. We will keep an eye on the chat. If we're not answering your question, it's either because we want to save it for a little bit later or because maybe it's just the kind of thing better talked about outside the group. Always happy to chat with people outside of the session, so don't hesitate to reach out. But yeah, big picture, feel free to get your questions over. The spirit of today is just kind of talking through legal guardrails, basic legal principles, both in the short term and long term. Because I'm a lawyer, I have to give you disclaimers. Obviously, we're just talking and educating here today. We're sharing information. It's not legal advice. Even if it really sounds like I'm giving you legal advice, I promise I'm not really giving you legal advice. I'm just trying to be helpful. So, just keep that in mind, of course. In the short term, we're going to be focused on things like formation requirements. I know a lot of your organizations have been around a while, but just sort of making sure everything was put together the way it was supposed to. Compliance requirements, what are the things you should be thinking about each year? And do you have all those boxes checked so you're not having to get caught up later? I'll talk a little bit about fiscal sponsorship and whether that's, you thinking about a new project and being under a fiscal sponsor, or maybe it's your established organization taking on a fiscally sponsored project. What does that look like when it's done right? And we'll talk about some longer term stuff, just what it is to be a public charity, and we'll talk about what that means. It feels like it's always about to be an election year, and there's always some, but it is about to be a big election year coming into next year. So things like lobbying and political advocacy, what are charities allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? How to sort of take a positive mindset to those rules and share a little bit about what they are. I'll talk to you about employees, contractors, volunteers a little bit. So, one place we see nonprofits get sideways on a little bit are the relationships with the people they pay or don't pay, and are they paying or not paying them correctly? And then the last thing, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit, just some big picture stuff about how nonprofits generate revenue and what's the compliant way to do it and what's not. I'm not too worried if we don't get to that thing. Like I said, I'm more interested in what you want to talk about. If there's good questions that come up, we'll slow it down and talk about them when we get a chance. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Patrick to cover the first item on our short-term test.
All right, thanks, Karl. So as the Black Eyed Peas said, let's get it started. Couldn't help myself. Sorry.
Well played.
So as you all know, the nonprofit tax-exempt world, it's highly regulated. And the reason for this, and I like to think of this because it kind of helps me understand why there are all these laws and regulations, within this world. It's because your tax-exempt organization, you're granted a huge benefit, tax exemption. And that benefit is granted in exchange for your organization's commitment to ensure donations are used towards a charitable mission. So this is based on the common belief that, charities are good for society as a whole. And so if your organization already exists, a lot of these items I'm going to go over, you should already have completed these. So I'll go quick, but if there's anything you're not sure about, just feel free to interrupt me, ask, and we can discuss how you can rectify that situation. So to start are your articles of incorporation. Think of this as your organization's constitution. This gets filed with the Secretary of State, and this creates your nonprofit corporation. But a key distinction, and I do this too, nonprofit and tax exempt are not the same thing, but they're used interchangeably. When you file your articles with the Secretary of State, that creates your nonprofit corporation. Tax exempt, that means what it says. And in order to get tax exemption, you have to go through the IRS on the federal level through a very lengthy application process. And next are your bylaws. So if the articles of are your constitution, the bylaws are basically your code of law. Those are the internal documents outlining how your organization runs. It's a really good idea to review these annually because, as Carmen said in her intro, things change. So you should really take a look at these every year, and you should really know what is in them. They're not optional. You have to follow your bylaws. Up next is the initial corporate action. This is really a written record of the first action that created your nonprofit corporation. And anything like this, it's good to keep written records because memories fade over time. You're not going to remember everything. And then next is a conflict of interest policy. So the IRS is looking for this as a sign of good governance within your organization. There's a question on the Form 990 itself that asks whether your organization has a conflict of interest policy, and you want to be able to answer yes to that question. But then as a reminder, conflicts, they can and do happen. It's okay. Your organization just needs to ensure that proper steps are taken to document the decision-making process. And then the next slide. So fiduciary duties.
Oh, let me just chime in with
Yeah.
one thing here, if that's okay, Patrick. I'm drunk with power because I have control of the slide deck. So the one thing I wanted to say about the articles of incorporation, and this is me as the California person, we actually have these two categories here in California: public benefit and religious. And in a couple slides from now, you'll see Patrick talk about some of the differences if you're one or if you're the other. So if you're not sure, I know everyone here is a lot of faith-based organizations here. If you're not sure which you are, it might be good to go back and look at those articles. And then the other thing, like I think Patrick said in those initial corporate actions, I've had a lot of clients over the years tell me, oh, these are directors and officers. And I say, okay, great. When were they appointed? Where were they appointed? And well, there's nothing. And then that makes it hard, right, to actually prove it. So I think all that's great stuff. Those are my two thoughts. I'll kick it over to the next slide.
Thanks, Karl. Okay, so fiduciary duties. So directors and officers of nonprofit corporations owe a fiduciary duty to the organization. So what really is that? So this is a heightened level of care. And it essentially means that directors and officers always have to put the best interest of the organization ahead of their own personal interest. And this makes sense since, these organizations are created for the public benefit. And the next up is board meetings. At the very least, you should have a set time for the annual meeting, because that's almost always required by state law. And it really should be covered by your bylaws. But if your bylaws don't say anything about meetings or an annual meeting, you'll want to amend the bylaws and get that taken care of. And again, for board meetings, you want to keep good records. Memories fade over time. 10 years from now, most people won't remember who was at that meeting, how somebody voted. And you never know when you'll really need those historical records. I was involved with a lawsuit here in Cincinnati where a critical part of the suit, it just came down to how certain directors voted on a matter, and there were no written records of that meeting. So it turned into he said, she said, which is just really, really hard to disprove. Or prove in any way. So you want to keep good records of meetings. So same with corporate records. That's like a document destruction and retention policy. It's nice to have, but you have to actually follow the policy. It doesn't do you any good if you have a policy that you never read or use. And it can come back to bite you if you're ever in litigation and there's a specific responsive document that was destroyed outside of the usual course of business. You won't get the benefit of the doubt in court that document was destroyed, for a legitimate reason. So next is financial statements and control. Again, the nonprofit world, transparency is key. So it's the utmost importance because your organizations are being entrusted with charitable funds that have to be used for public benefit. And so what I recommend is you need your board members to review financial statements, and you want them to ask questions. And then make sure there are internal controls to ensure there are no financial mishaps. And again, this all comes within your policies, so follow your policies. And then the last one is director and officer insurance. This isn't a requirement, but it's good to have, especially when you're recruiting new board members. I've found that some people will be a little nervous about potential liability issues, so this really brings some peace of mind to them. And then the next slide.
All right, I'll do it one more time. The only thing I wanted to toss in on this one, I think around board meetings. I just want to underline what Patrick said here. Every audit I've ever been a part of any kind, whether an attorney general audit or an IRS audit, always starts with the same question, which is send us all the minutes of your board meetings over the last few years. And you don't look great when you have to say, yeah, we've never really taken minutes. You want to be able to show those, they don't have to be this detailed. He said this, she said this on for pages, but you want to document that the board exercise those fiduciary duties. They thought about stuff, they asked questions, they voted on this next topic. I think that's really important. But yeah, that's my last note.
Yeah, no, great point. Thanks, Karl. Okay, so next slide. So you'll see atop the top of the slide, there's 4 different agencies that your California nonprofit organization has to interact with. And so you'll see it's the IRS, California Franchise Tax Board, California Secretary of State, California Attorney General. So again, the nonprofit world is highly regulated. I've had clients in Ohio receive letters from the California Attorney General saying, hey, you should be registered in California to solicit charitable contributions. And my clients are like, wait a minute, how'd they even, find out? So the California Attorney General, the New York Attorney General, and the Pennsylvania Attorney General are by far the most aggressive attorney generals in the country when it comes to charitable organizations. So you all should be aware of that. So then you'll see at the bottom of the slide, there's a sliding scale of least and most regulated based on your organization type. So churches are the least regulated, while private foundations are the most regulated. But one very important note is that while churches and religious organizations, may be exempt from certain regulations, it's critical to ensure your organization genuinely qualifies for that exemption, because exemptions, they're narrowly tailored and they're often misunderstood. And you should also understand that, your religious organization, it still has to comply with local zoning ordinances, fire codes, building codes, employee withholding taxes, stuff like that. And so again, we have the IRS on the federal level, the California Franchise Tax Board, California Secretary of State, California Attorney General. Starting with the IRS. The IRS is the primary regulator for federal tax exempt status. So they ensure compliance with federal tax laws. Their key functions in the nonprofit world are they review and approve applications for tax exempt status. So that can be Form 1023 or 1023-EZ. They also monitor organizations through annual reporting requirements, which is IRS Form 990. And there's 3 different versions of the Form 990 depending on your annual revenue. And most churches do not usually have to file a 990, but you should note that if your church has unrelated business income over $1,000, you'll most likely have to file a 990T. So just remember that if you are part of a church organization. And then the IRS is another power they have is revoking your organization's tax exempt status for non-compliance. So this could be from not filing Form 990 for 3 consecutive years, or there's private benefit problems. And so the IRS, and that would really probably be the death of your organization if they revoked your tax exempt status. So moving on to the California Franchise Tax Board. Yes, Karl.
Yeah. Before we switch, I just had one thought, which is the difference between a church and a faith-based organization. You can feel free to add anything you want, Patrick. I mean, just from my perspective, so this is a really important reminder because, like Patrick said, churches have it great under the tax law. They don't have to file an application. They don't have to file annual returns. But not every religious organization is a church. And a church, it doesn't literally mean a church because the First Amendment doesn't prescribe one particular religion. It does mean the thing that is the house of worship, a congregation. There's a number of factors that go into it, but it is the entity that is doing the religious services and community. That part of it. A hospital associated with a church does not get the benefits of being a church, but the church associated with the church gets the benefits of being a church. Similarly, a temple, a synagogue, a mosque could get the benefits of being a church. So I just wanted to call it out because, like as Patrick said, there's a really some nice benefits for being a church. If you're not a church, you both have to do that exemption application and you got to file those 990s. Just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, no, that's a really important distinction. And I feel like we see that a lot where religious organizations treat themselves like churches. And that can get your organization in a lot of trouble and potentially lose your tax exempt status. So moving on to the California Franchise Tax Board, a good way to summarize the franchise tax, it's basically like the IRS at the state level. So it's the state level agency that oversees nonprofit taxation. They ensure compliance with California state tax laws. And then their key functions are the Franchise Tax Board, they'll review applications for state tax exemption in California, that's a unique California requirement. A lot of states don't require filing for tax exemption on the state level. And that is form 3500. And then the annual reporting form is form 199. And the tax board, they do have the authority to impose penalties for non-compliance. And you want to ensure your organization is in good standing with the FTB, because it can be a lot of paperwork to get back into good standing with the Franchise Tax Board. And again, you have to understand what exactly your organization has to file based on the type it is. It's so important. And then moving on to the California Secretary of State. So the California Secretary of State is responsible for all corporations, including your nonprofit corporation. So that is where your organization would have filed its articles of incorporation. If you ever have to amend your articles, you go through the Secretary of State. And again, the articles of incorporation, it's the constitution of your organization. So you always want to make sure it's accurate to what you're really doing as an organization. And then the Secretary of State, there's always a filing. They have a statement of information, which is filed every other year. And it's basically just telling them, hey, we exist, here's a filing fee. But the problem is, if you don't do that filing, your status with the Secretary of State will be moved into inactive. And you can potentially lose the corporate protections that the Secretary of State provides by being a corporation.
Yeah, I mean, one little nuance here in California, this is something I just see all the time, is because these are sort of your four regulator friends when you're here in California, right? And the three California ones, they do all talk to each other. So if you do mess up with one, it can have a cascading effect where, okay, we forgot to file our Secretary of State form. That went on long enough that they told the Franchise Tax Board about it, and then they suspended us. And then one of them told the AG about it. Now the AG says we can't do anything. So really it is like, I always tell people it's not that hard to be a California charity as long as you don't fall behind. If you always stay ahead of it, it's okay. Once you fall behind, it's a real pain to get your status reinstated. So just keep that in mind. I think that was a great summary of the Secretary of State stuff.
Right. And then so the Attorney General, it's the protector of charitable assets in the public interest. The role of the Attorney General is to ensure charities operate in accordance with their charitable purposes, which again, that's found in your articles of incorporation. Some of the key functions of the Attorney General is they handle charitable registration. So your organization, if it's a church, religious organization, may be exempt from charitable registration. But any public charity, and really most groups that have charitable assets in California, are supposed to register. Again, like Karl just said, it's not a complicated process, but you have to do it every year. It coincides with your 990, potentially your audit. There's just several moving parts. But if you do not stay up to date on your Attorney General filings, you'll be in bad standing with the Attorney General, and technically you're not allowed to solicit charitable contributions when you're in bad standing with the Attorney General. So something definitely to keep aware of. And again, the Attorney General has broad authority over the nonprofit sector. The Attorney General can enforce actions against fraudulent or negative or negligent activities. The Attorney General is usually involved in dissolution of nonprofits, as well as removing restrictions from specific funds. And again, all of this compliance is key. You have to, as Karl said, if you mess up with one of these state agencies, it's a domino effect, and suddenly you're out of compliance with all three of these. And you have to protect your organization's tax exempt status. So I recommend to have written instructions regarding what filings are due and when. Put those on a calendar, because I often see organizations go out of compliance with all of these regulators and filings when they have employee turnover, because they have one employee kind of handling everything. They have all the knowledge, and suddenly they're gone. and these filings are just forgotten about. And then all of a sudden you're getting these nasty letters from the tax board, Secretary of State, Attorney General saying you missed all of these filings. And it's much harder to catch up with these filings after the fact than just getting them done on time. So again, some tips for maintaining good status: calendar all your filing dead times or deadlines. Regularly review and update your governing documents, because things change, laws change. Keep accurate financial records, and then cooperate with the regulators. If you get a letter from the Attorney General, don't ignore them. Don't try to play coy. They're not trying to put charities out of business. They're just trying to make sure they are compliant with the law.
I totally agree with that. I think more than anything else, if you have to embrace the idea of trying to, if you've made mistakes, come clean. If you should have registered earlier, but you didn't, if you take that attitude with them, these things tend to go fine. This is not different, perhaps in other branches of a regulator. These are ones that really just want to make sure the charitable sector is working. So the best thing you can do is just kind of be transparent and clear. One thing I'll say before I switch gears and maybe cover a question or two is the Attorney General piece. When I did this, it's always been true that it's bad to be out of compliance with the AG. Over the last year, there's been some new laws, rules somewhere in California that basically says states and cities won't do business with you if you are out of compliance with the AG. So we have had clients lose contracts, lose funding because they didn't know they weren't registered, they didn't know they weren't doing the reports, and it's caused real harm. And I've had situations where we want to come and we're like, please, we have this money we're going to lose if you don't do it, and the AG is like, look, you and everybody else, it's going to take us 90 days to process your application. So if you're unsure about your AG status, now is a good time to check in. I will say, this is for a talk for faith-based groups, there's a good chance you might be a religious corporation, and religious corporations don't need to register. But if you go back to your articles and it says public benefit corporation, that means you almost certainly should be registered. And so, I would look into that and make sure when you go on the AG's website and you search the name of your organization, you find it there and it says current and it doesn't say delinquent or never registered with us, because it's better to get out ahead of it because they are moving slowly. I did want to answer one question that someone asked along the way. Dolores asked, what is UBIT, which is a great question. I'm going to give you the short version now and the longer version maybe later in the presentation. But UBIT stands for Unrelated Business Income Tax. UBIT is what charity, in general, charities don't pay taxes. That's the nice thing about being a charity. UBIT is the one kind of tax they do pay, and they pay that when they generate income from active businesses that are regularly conducted that aren't related to your charitable purpose. So that can come up in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about it more later. But if you have that kind of income, just know that you have an additional form to file. And so this is a question with your accountant, tax preparer to understand. I would say 70, 80%, 90% of charities don't have UBIT, but if you do, it doesn't automatically mean you're going to lose your exemption, but it does mean you have to pay some taxes and file some forms, right? I'll keep on moving, but again, feel free to ask any questions you have as we go. I wanted to do a few slides on fiscal sponsorship. If you looked in a code book, a book of law, tried to find where it defines fiscal sponsorship, you wouldn't find it. This is not a legally defined term. Fiscal sponsorship is a term that's developed over the years to describe the ways that charities interact with people outside their organization that are not charities. So small group of people have an idea for a project. They're not sure if they want to start a whole new nonprofit corporation to do it. They might look into being a fiscally sponsored project. In short, it's an existing charity that sponsors the project instead of your own organization. Or they re-grant funds. So there's sort of two ways it can kind of take place, and we'll get into the charts and go through them. But basically the idea is an existing charity is vouching for a project. They're saying, I think this is a charitable educational activity. We'd be happy to accept donations for it. and either let the project operate under our umbrella or re-grant funds to it, rather than make them go get their own tax exempt status. When done right, fiscal sponsorship is great because it unlocks access to the tax exempt money, charitable donations to organizations that might not otherwise be able to afford to put the infrastructure together to get access to it. And it lets different projects consolidate under one charity that knows what they're doing, so they can just focus on mission and not worry about some of the back office stuff. It's not always done correctly, and that creates both legal risk and practical risk in terms of disputes and tension and conflict. So the pros are it creates that access. The cons are, the thing that people don't always understand at the core of fiscal sponsorship is that it is the sponsor's money. The sponsor is the one that receives the money. They have control and what's called a variance power. They can use that money for the restricted purpose, however they want to use it. Now they're operating into a trust-based relationship with some project, and they're saying, hey, when we raise money for this, as long as it's legal to do it, to do this work with you, we're going to have you do this work for us. You can run it. We trust you to make decisions. But ultimately, this is, at the moment, it's donated our money. So that's important. Typically, from the project's perspective, what they're going to pay a fiscal sponsorship fee, which is another way of saying that when the sponsor raises that money, they're going to carve out a certain percentage for the cost of running this project, right? The cost of being responsible. And so that could be 5%, 10%, 15%. Lots of different sponsors charge different rates, usually something around there. This isn't a fiscal sponsorship presentation, but I still need to share my little charts. One of these charts this is probably the most common kind of fiscal sponsorship, which is called Model A fiscal sponsorship. So what you can see is that in a Model A fiscal sponsorship, there's one box that there's the sponsor. That is the entity that houses the project. All of the donations are donated to the sponsor. They are spent by the sponsor. If there are employees, contractors, volunteers, they are contracting with the sponsor. The sponsor houses all of it. It's the only legal entity. The project is really this kind of informal group of people that are being trusted to run this project on behalf of the charity. So you'll see donors make a donation to the sponsor. Everything happens on the sponsor's books. It's all its activity, its liability, its responsibility to make sure that everything is done charitably. And you might have some outside people, like a particular person or a particular committee that says, here's how we'd like the funds to be spent, and gets some leeway to run it on behalf of the project. What's really important if I'm talking to projects, I'm telling them what's really important to understand about fiscal sponsorship is the sponsor's control. Like, they have to have that legal control. You need to make sure that when people give, they give to that sponsor. They're not trying to earmark it for you personally, because you personally are not a charitable entity. And so those are what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the project. When I'm talking to sponsors, I'm talking about supervision. You need to understand what your projects are doing. There's room to let them operate, but if they cause harm, if they use the money inappropriately, if they go do things that charities aren't allowed to do, that is your charity's liability, right? So you are taking on the full thing. So you need to maintain control. There was something in Patrick's presentation I meant to mention, which is financial controls, so important. And that's especially true in the context of fiscal sponsorship, where you're inviting other people into your organization in a sense, especially with Model A fiscal sponsorship. Everyone thinks embezzlement can't happen to them, but it can. And it is, it can happen to all kinds of organizations. And that's a whole other talk about how that stuff happens and what to do about it. But one good rule of thumb is always have multiple eyes on everything, multiple eyes on the books. Don't create situations where people can spend your money without someone else knowing about it, right? So that's Model A sponsorship. That's fiscal sponsorship that happens inside of the sponsor, which would be the established charity. Model C fiscal sponsorship, probably a little less common, a little bit different. This is when you have a sponsor that is raising money and re-granting to another organization. So instead of saying, hey, I'm going to hire all the people, and the sponsor is going to hire all the people and house the whole thing, the sponsor is saying, look, you don't have a tax exemption. Your organization doesn't have a tax exempt letter. Maybe it's a new nonprofit that's still waiting for its IRS letter. Maybe it's just an entity, an LLC that doesn't know what it wants to do yet. I'm a sponsor. I can receive those charitable contributions. And I'm going to say, I'm willing to give them to you, but it comes with a catch. The catch is that here's a grant agreement. You have to use it for these purposes. And of course, we'll take our fee out before we grant it. This is common when fiscal sponsorship is done correctly. This can be a really helpful way to incubate new projects. So the IRS can take a long time sometimes, like Patrick mentioned. Sometimes they take 6 to 8 months to process exemption applications. But Model C fiscal sponsorship is a nice way for new entities to get money in the meantime. On the other hand, when the fiscal sponsorship is done wrong, it's often some version of this where money is either not being donated to the sponsor the way it's supposed to be, or there's language that's not appropriate, there's earmarking, or just this other entity isn't doing what it's supposed to do with the money. So this is a way to do fiscal sponsorship, but it's a little more, it comes with a few more different things to think about. I am coming up on a slide break. I think they were not quite halfway through, but close. So if we want to take Shai and Carmen, does a 5-minute break still sound good here on your end?
Yes, yes.
Okay, let's take it now, and then we can power through the rest of the presentation after. So feel free to kill your audio video and check your emails, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess we should start summoning people back. Let's see here. I'll click it over to the next slide, and I think I'll be handing it off to you, Patrick. I think we
Yeah.
did the sort of short-term planning of like, if I were you, these are the things I would check on first. Make sure you're in good shape, and you set up your fiscal sponsorship role and get it fixed. And I think we'll hand over to Patrick to talk about sort of more long-term planning.
Yes, thanks, Karl. So I'm going to touch on requirements for 501c3 public charities, which is a very highly regulated industry, as we discussed earlier. So one thing, assets must be permanently devoted to a charitable mission, so no private benefit. Charitable missions include relief of the poor, advancement of education or science, advancement of religion, lessening the burden of government, and eliminating prejudice and discrimination. So some of the benefits of a public charity versus a private foundation, one is there's no set distribution requirements. And the other, and Karl's actually going to talk about this some more, is a public charity. A lot of organizations don't realize they can do some lobbying, and probably a lot more than they would think. But again, Karl's going to touch on that. And then if you'll see in the middle of the slide, there's talk about fair market value transactions only, no excessive private benefit, no inurement. So this kind of goes back to the conflict of interest policy I was speaking about earlier. So there can be conflicts. You just have to make sure you follow your policy and procedures and really document the decision making. So what happens if your organization is not compliant with the tax requirements? So like I said earlier, the big one would be loss of tax exemption. I'm not sure how your organization would maintain if it lost its tax exemption. So that's really the big one. You can lose the loss of donor deductions because, that's a huge benefit to your donors. And if they can't take a deduction, there's a good chance they may not make a contribution to your organization. And then the other is attorney general action. And, kind of depending on what is going on, that can be a very long and drawn out process. So the major keys for ongoing compliance, long-term compliance for charities, the top one is your Form 990. So your organization, if it's church, it may not have to file this. So you really have to determine whether your organization has to file the Form 990. And so the Form 990, it's an informational return. It's like a tax return, but since there's no income tax, it's informational. You report all your financials on there. There's 3 different levels. If you're a large organization, you'll be filling out the full Form 990, which it's a lot of work. Mid-size organizations fill out the 990 EZ, which is a few pages. And then smaller organizations, if your income is under 50,000, you're filing the 990N online. And that's very simple to do. You can do it yourself probably. And I want to focus on the 990 because you can lose your tax exempt status if your organization does not file its 990 for 3 consecutive years. And this happens a lot more than you think, especially with smaller organizations, especially smaller volunteer run organizations. Because like I was saying before, there's a lot of knowledge that can get lost as volunteers turn over. And I've seen it happen to so many organizations where they'll have a very committed volunteer kind of running everything in the background. That person leaves, and the people who are still there just have no idea that they're supposed to be filing this Form 990, and then the organization loses its tax exempt status, and it's a pain to regain that tax exempt status. So the number one key from this is just make sure your organization is filing its 990 every single year. You do not want to go through the process of reinstating your tax exempt status. It's not a fun process. So I'm going to kick it back to Karl for the next slide.
Yeah, now before I switch gears, I guess let me just kind of call out a couple of things I thought about as you were talking, Patrick. I mean, like on the earlier slides, churches get this perk of not filing a 990. If you're a small organization, you're regularly, like Patrick just said, regularly below 50,000, you might have to get away with filing a short form. I often wonder whether that's good for your organization, because a 990 is a chance to make sure you have good financials, to make sure you can sign off that you're doing things the way you're supposed to be. If you have transactions with your insiders, which I'll come back to in a second, you're doing them correctly. And so I sometimes, when I deal with clients that are classified as churches, I often see things that have been going wrong for a long time, that if they had to file a 990 or keep accurate financials and do reporting, they probably would have realized earlier was a problem. So keep that in mind, that even if you don't file a 990, I would take that same energy and put it towards your financial statements. Do you have good financial statements? Are you looking them at your annual meeting? Do you feel good about them? I think those are the things I would sort of refocus on.
Yeah, that's,
The
I
other
mean,
thing,
the
yeah, go ahead.
990, I'm sorry, Carl, that the 990 is a really good, basically, compliance checkup. You know, you can look
Yeah.
at it every year and you want to be able to answer these questions affirmatively. And if you're not, you can kind of, reflect and say, hey, what do we, as an organization, what do we need to do to answer yes to these questions? So it's a great point, Carl.
Totally. No, and the only other thing I wanted to add here was on my little yellow hard to see arrow. I want to spend a little time talking about insiders and the relationship, because often some of the people on the call might be those insiders. You might be the executive director, you might be the founder, you might be certainly one of the directors. Your conflict of interest policy, like Patrick says, is a huge help. It's supposed to be a roadmap. But I will say there are so many different rules and the way they'll interact with each other that I don't think I've ever been able to give someone a conflict of interest policy that is both easy to read and covers everything you need to know. It's a bit of a mess. But big picture, a few principles just to kind of walk away from this thinking about. Nobody owns a nonprofit, right? It is possible to structure your nonprofit that someone might control it or might appoint the board. But in general, nobody owns a nonprofit. They are public assets, not your assets. If you want to set up your own for-profit, that's great. Once you set up a nonprofit, you're giving up the idea of ownership. When you give up the idea of ownership, you give up the idea of profits, right? So how much you are being paid by your organization on a year-to-year basis is disconnected from this concept of profit. So like, that's step one. When we say no inurement, it's a old-timey word for this idea of not taking the profits. It's not that your nonprofit can't pay you. Your nonprofit can pay a reasonable salary based on what's fair market value for your services. Sometimes those numbers can be large. Sometimes look at your average. A college football coach is a nonprofit employee and they are paid well. Same with doctors of nonprofit hospitals and administrators. Like it's not about being paid poorly or not poorly. It's about not being paid profits, and it's about being paid no more than fair market value. So as the numbers start going up and those transactions are with people that are insiders, they have power of the organization. The board or the appropriate officer, if it's someone below the CEO, should be taking a close look at what that pay amount is and make sure they're comfortable with it, and make sure that there are salary surveys out there to look at to make sure that you're not paying someone 2 or 3 times what everyone else is paying them. Sometimes that might feel like a luxury problem. If we had, everyone might want to pay their employees more than they do. But this definitely comes up, especially when you're sort of founding your own project, is sometimes people treat it a little too much like their own for-profit, and those are two very different things. So yeah, now from there, I will take, and please do feel free to get your questions out. I don't think we're going to run out of stuff we talk about. I'm happy to stare in awkward silence for 20 minutes at the end of this presentation. But if you got questions that are coming up along the way, feel free to ask them, and we can go at any level of detail you want. We're going to talk about politics for a second. What could go wrong there? That's always a fun conversation. Really, I'm just going to talk about it in the context of
Lord, oh Lord, oh my God.
Exactly. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of what charities can do and what they can't do. And there's a way of talking about these rules that is overly negative, that makes people feel like they just shouldn't do anything that involves having an opinion about anything. And that's not Good. I'll talk about why that's not good. Well, there are two sets of rules that we have to deal with as a 501c3. A 501c3 can never do any candidate activity. So you see that red circle is no candidate activity. Sometimes it's called electioneering. Sometimes it's called campaign intervention. The gist is you can't support or oppose a political candidate. So do vote for so-and-so, don't vote for so-and-so. That is bad. Does it mean you can never interact with a candidate? No, but I would be careful in how you introduce that person if they come to speak at your fundraiser. They're a longtime supporter of the organization. Great. They're a longtime supporter and they would be a great mayor. Bad, right? So those are, no supporting opposing candidates. Any amount of that is theoretically a basis for revocation. There are some people that are under the at least legal misconception that rule is different for churches and religious-based organizations. It's not true, though there is some elements to that. In the last administration, there was certainly stuff put out about the idea of wanting to empower campaigning from the pulpit, sometimes it's called, right? So legally speaking, your 501c3 employee, no matter who they are, when they're speaking on behalf of the 501c3 or with 501c3 funds, should not express an opinion. It's true that I see more non-compliance in churches in this than in other organizations, but the law is still the law on this one, and your 501c3 should stay on the right side of it, which is to not support or oppose candidates. Okay, that's rule number one. It's red because it's clear, don't do it. The rule that's a lot less clear is the lobbying rule, which is yellow because you can do some of it as a public charity. Note that you can't do it as a private foundation, and if private foundations are making grants to you, they might tell you that you can't do it with their money. And if that's true, okay, follow those rules. Otherwise, it is something you can do some of. I'm going to do this verbally now, and there's going to be a really complicated flow chart you can pour over later. But I will break down lobbying into lobbying in this context is about trying to influence legislation. So it is communicating to a legislator with a specific view about legislation. It's one way to do lobbying. There's one other way to do lobbying, and that's communicating to the general public about legislation with a specific view and making a call to action. And we'll get into that more when we look at the flow chart. Outside of that, it's not lobbying. So if you are talking about legislation to the general public, but you don't include a call to action, so you say AB whatever number is great, but you don't say go call your legislator, then that's not lobbying. And you can do as much of that as you want as part of your educational mission. That's in the big blue category of political advocacy that is safe. If you are wanting to talk to the governor about changing their enforcement priorities around how they're going to enforce this particular law, that is not lobbying because you're not talking to a legislator, you're talking to the governor. Go back to the Schoolhouse Rock, the executive branch is different than the legislative branch, and the executive branch is safe to talk to, unless it's about vetoing a bill, then it would be lobbying, but we're not doing that today. So some stuff, there's lots of stuff that is not lobbying, but to be clear, even doing true lobbying, having a day where you'll go to Sacramento and talk to state senate or state assemblies staffers about your perspective on different bills, that's lobbying, but that can be okay. You just can't do a substantial amount. What is substantial? Well, there's a test you can opt into. It's called the 501H election. Your organization might have filed it. It might not have. It's a good question to ask if you do some of this activity. If you filed that election, then, and you're a relatively small organization, like less than, let's say, $20 million, you can typically do up to 20% of your operating budget on lobbying, and that's a lot, right? And so 20% of your budget. So there is a lot of lobbying you can do, but if you're going to get into it, you need to have a good sense of what is and is not lobbying, so I know what to count, and am I counting to make sure I'm staying under my limit. So as you go into next year and political issues heat up, know that you can talk about the issues. Issue advocacy is fine. You can do a little bit of talking about legislation, and there are a bunch of exceptions that we'll cover a little bit more in a minute. But you can never talk about this person should win the election, this person should lose the election. I'm going to flip to the next slide.
Well, I have one thing to add, Carl, just
Oh,
because
yeah.
I've been asked this multiple times by executive directors or presidents
Yeah.
of nonprofit corporations. You're allowed to put election signs in your own yard. You're not
Yes.
speaking on behalf of your organization. That's your personal business. That is fine to do. Just don't speak on behalf of your organization. That's all I'm saying.
That is an extremely good point. Like, you don't give up your First Amendment rights by being a 501c3 employee. You're still a human being with opinions and can vote and can express opinion. But if you see in people's like social media bio, these opinions are my own, one reason that's there is so that your organization doesn't get tagged with your own opinion. So yeah, really important point. So when I give like this version of the talk, some people are sort of like, well, I think I'd rather just not do anything because that's easier. Doing nothing is always easier than doing something, right? Look, if you want to take that opinion, that's your true. I tend to think about it as like, there's a risk to doing nothing, right? Because you're already a nonprofit, you're already starting at a disadvantage, right? As a 501c3, you have these limitations, and on the other hand, for-profits are don't have these limitations. They can spend as much as they want. Rich individuals can spend as much as they want on the issues you care about, and they might have a different opinion than you. So, for example, in my hypothetical, I picked a few issues you might care about: environmental preservation, public health, criminal justice reform. On the one side is a nonprofit, and then the other side are companies that can spend as much as they want. So you're already at a disadvantage. So to me, there's a risk of putting your head in the sand and not doing anything on the issues you care about, right? Because there's going to be people on the other side that don't have the same compunction or are not as obedient to are not as afraid of doing this activity. So as we go into this election year and just being in a perpetually politicized environment, I do think it's important to understand what your know what your 501c3 can do, know where the limits are, but don't take it as a thing of we should never take a perspective on an issue that affects our mission, right? I'm going to save that flow chart for another time, though it is useful. It is in the materials, and this is a way of figuring out whether something is lobbying. I believe I stole this from Alliance for Justice, which is I'll give a plug for as a great resource for organizations that want to understand how they can be involved politically without getting in trouble, right? So that flowchart is in the materials. I won't bore you with it, other than to say it emphasizes how many exceptions there are, right? There's a lot of ways to get something to not be lobbying. And so if there's something you want to do and you're willing to spend a little bit of time thinking about it, there's probably a way to do what you want to do that doesn't violate the rules. So give it some thought and check out those resources. I will break for questions. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but we'll give you this particular moment to, if you want to come off mic, now's your chance. I do see one question I will use while you're, and Patrick already answered it, which is fantastic. Someone asked, what is S corporation income? Patrick gave a very thorough answer. I will just call out, and we're going to get to UBIT on later in the chart, so I'll talk about that more later. Anyone want to verbally toss in a question before we keep rolling? I'll permit 10 seconds of awkward silence while we figure that out.
This is Carmen. I'll fill in that 10 seconds of awkward silence, and it's for a very selfish reason. I'm interested in a Model C project, and so is the fiscal sponsor held accountable for say lobbying or other issues that the Model C project may engage in?
That's a great question.
And I'll mute myself.
Yeah. The short answer is kind of. Yeah, I mean, yes. And when I always tell people, use the word sponsor and fiscal sponsor like the word vouch. You are saying this is a good charitable project, and you're going to have a grant agreement with them that requires them to follow the rules. So when you have that grant agreement, your grant agreement should prohibit candidate activity, because your 501c3 can't do any of that. Your grant agreement should prohibit doing anything that's not charitable. So just sort of going off and doing just a regular old business without anything charitable about it. That would not be that's something you are responsible for that, though you're responsible for it as the way a grant maker is responsible. You have an agreement, you need to spend the money this way. If they don't spend the money this way, you need to ask for it back and stop giving them any more money, right?
Right.
So the short answer is yes. When it comes to lobbying specifically, it's a little complicated because, again, you can do some lobbying, but if they do some lobbying, I would say that the safe thing to do is the sponsor should count that towards their lobbying total. So we have this, we made this grant, they did some lobbying with it, so that grant counts as a lobbying expense. Most charities don't use enough of their lobbying limit, so I think that's not necessarily a problem, but something to keep in mind.
Wow. Okay.
Got
So thank
go
you.
ahead. Yeah, no, great question, Carmen.
I
And
was just saying thank you. Okay.
Great question. And another great question in the chat is, can you repeat or discuss the liability of board members? So this is like, of course, very good because a lot of you are directors and I see a hand up. We'll get to that in a second too. The short answer is that, but just by a director is not automatically liable for the debts of your organization. If you're on a board and your organization goes under and can't pay its bills, you are not liable for your organization's bills. A director or an officer only becomes liable if they breach their fiduciary duty. So they don't exercise the duty of care. They don't act like a reasonable director when operating the corporation, or they act self-interestedly. They approve a transaction in which they do enrich themselves. In those situations, you can be liable to the corporation, and that liability could be either enforced by the corporation or by an attorney general that could come in and say, look, you harmed charitable assets. So this is why when we covered fiduciary duties, those are the things when you're serving on boards that you should focus in on, because as long as you're following those, showing up at meetings, asking questions, doing your best to make decisions, doesn't mean you always have to be right, but you have to try to be reasonable and follow a good process and follow those rules around insider transactions. Any other questions? I think there was one more person had their hand up. If they want to come off mute or type in the chat, whatever works.
Good morning. I'm
Good morning.
from Buena Vista United Methodist. Our church rents our social hall to another nonprofit that runs a disability program. So they do pay a modest rent, but I'm assuming because it is related to our charitable work or that it's okay. It's not unrelated business income.
Yeah, you're correct. And for two reasons though. So good news number one is, yeah, that's probably related. It sounds like a related activity. The other reason is that rental income is almost always not taxable anyway. So there's an exception from UBIT for passive income, rent, royalties, interest, gain, and dividends. Those are generally not taxable. So even if you rented it to me, that would be non-taxable income. There is an exception there, and exceptions to exceptions. So if you had a mortgage on the property, it could make it taxable. But if it's if it's mortgage property and it's related, then that's okay. Then that's safe again. So I would say the short answer is yes. If you're renting it for a related purpose, that's generally going to be safe. Sounds like a good example. One thing we're not going to talk about today, but might in the future, but might be a good thing to think about: property tax exemption issues. So as a nonprofit, if you own your property in California and it is operated either by you or another nonprofit, and it is only used for charitable activities, you can have tax exemption. But if one of those things falls off, you will not have property tax exemption. So in other words, if you rent your property to me, now it won't be a tax exempt property for property tax purposes, because I am not a nonprofit. If you rent it to a nonprofit and they use it to run a gas station, that will not be a tax exempt activity because the gas station is not a charitable activity. So it is important when you have real property to both, think about the income tax, think about the rent, but also think about, is there property tax exemption on this? We don't want to lose it. One thing county assessors love doing is trying to get more money into the county's coffers. So if you be wary of that. It's a great question.
All right. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And we'll come back for more questions towards the end. because this is one of the questions was a really good segue. We're gonna talk about people for a second. There is one other way directors can be personally liable in a way that's kind of outside the usual course. At some point, Congress passed and the IRS enforces a rule that an organization's, I believe, directors and officers can be held personally liable for the organization's failure to satisfy its payroll tax obligations. Well, what are your payroll tax obligations? That is, if you hire someone and they are properly classified as an employee, your organization is supposed to withhold and pay payroll tax, right? You withhold part of their income and you pay payroll tax. That is how it's supposed to be when your person is an employee. So why do I say that in the context of personal liability? Well, this is something the IRS thinks about a lot because there are a lot of people out there that are paying people and calling them contractors. Let me show you this very silly but meaningful to me pie chart about contractors and employees. Sometimes the joke in California is that there's two kinds of categories, employees and misclassified employees. In other words, that there's a lot of people out there calling people contractors that should be classified as employees. And of course, there was all this, after a recent case, there was all this stuff around Lyft and Uber actually got a law passed to make sure that their drivers weren't called employees, because otherwise, if they were, then they'd have to do things like withhold payroll tax and have health insurance and other things, right? So it is really important if you are paying someone to either treat them as employee or feel comfortable that they meet the definition of someone who is not employee. If you are not paying someone, that person is a volunteer. It is also, and we'll talk about this a little bit, and maybe now is the time. Volunteers are people you don't pay for their services. Sometimes people will ask me the question, well, how much can I pay my volunteers? And I get really confused because you just told me they were a volunteer. Why are you paying them? And that might seem innocent because people want to be grateful. But the problem is once you start paying people, once people are working for payment, now, well, how much did you pay them? Oh, we paid them, we gave out gift cards. This is a relevant example. In the Bay Area, we gave out gift cards for $20 a day. We brought in people in our community to come and help clean up the streets and do these jobs. And, we give them a gift card for $20 at the end of the day. Well, that sounds nice, except, now that you're paying them for their services, let me tell you about something called a minimum wage, right? And so is $20 for a full day's work a minimum wage? It is not, right? So either you are paying them or you are not paying them. I generally advise against blurring the lines. If you work with a lawyer, you work with advisors, there can be some room to do certain kinds of things. You can certainly pay volunteers expenses, but you can't pay your volunteers because then they're not volunteers, they're employees, you're not paying enough, to oversimplify it. Similarly speaking, I hear people say, oh, we're just going to 1099 that person instead of give them a W-2. This is not something you get to choose. Somebody is either a contractor or they are not a contractor. I'm going to switch to what that test is in a minute, and then I think you'll understand why I have that yellow contractor sliver so small, because most people don't actually fall in that category, which means I'm guessing, and no shame, probably people in this room and their organization have people that are paying as contractors that maybe are probably more properly classified as employees. So I'm going to show you the test and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong about that. So this is what the test is in California. The test is a little bit different from state to state, but it's not that different. The basic idea is that someone is assumed an employee. If you pay someone for services, they are an employee unless you can prove otherwise. So is the person free from the control and direction as they perform their work? So think about this as the independent word, an independent contractor. Are they more independent than your employees when they do your work? Okay, that's a start. Let's assume that's true. Is this person performing work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business? That's a requirement to be an independent contractor. So sometimes I've heard somebody ask me, well, our executive director is an independent contractor. And I say, well, that's interesting. Now I will say, like, if there's an LLC, if they're providing their services through a business entity, then yes, business entities are always going to be contractors. But if you're telling me that an individual person is an independent contractor and they are your executive director, I don't understand how being the executive director could ever be outside the usual course of business. It is really your entire business. So that's, if that resonates with you as a familiar fact pattern, something to chat about with somebody. The third, so let's assume you satisfy the first two. Okay, it really is something. Let's say you're paying someone to be your bookkeeper. Okay, and I don't know if that's really outside the course. Let's just say it is for a second. Okay, and they operate independently, and it's outside the usual course. You're not a bookkeeping business. You know, you're just having someone pay to keep your books. You still have to satisfy the third prong, which is that they need to be customarily engaged in that trader business. Another way of saying it is they need other clients. If you are the only person they are doing this service for, right? They're just doing this for you and nobody else. They're not in the business of being a bookkeeper. Then that they are an employee and not an independent contractor under California law. So that is why when I say, when you run through this ABC test and see how many people actually end up being employee contractors, it looks more like this than it does, 50-50 split, right? And there's a lot, this is a common problem. And I'm bringing it up again because someone asked liability of board members. Your organization's not doing it right, and the IRS comes down on your organization and says, where's our payroll tax that you're supposed to be paying for this person's services? They can look to everybody, including you, the directors and officers. So keep that in mind. I think I'm coming back to the volunteer point, sort of made this verbally. You know, one of the nice things about being a nonprofit is that you can have volunteers. Our law firm's a business. We can't have people just volunteer and do our work for us. They have to pay us. We have to pay them, right? A nonprofit can have people come do their work for them, but like my earlier point, it needs to be without promise, expectation, or receipt of any compensation. If they are coming to work for you for the $20 gift card at the end of the day, that employee, that gift card is not enough. They are an employee, and so keep that in mind. And just keep it in mind. One thing that organizations stress about, probably more an employment lawyer question than a me and Patrick question. But it can be tough when organizations have both employees and volunteers, right? Because when you have people doing the same job, it can get confusing. And what you want to avoid is one of those volunteers showing up and suing you for unpaid wages, saying, "Hey, you had me do the same job as employees, and you paid them, but you didn't pay me." So important thing to think about. And again, in terms of topicality, that's not a word. Current events in the Bay Area. This is a big case recently with a Bay Area nonprofit of, again, thinking they were doing something good by paying volunteers and gift cards, but it didn't work out that way. So this is a real issue to keep on track. Let's talk about money. I'm going to show a complicated chart that don't feel like you need to fully intake because this is just my own rambling nonsense. But I sometimes show this chart to people when they're thinking about whether they want to do a nonprofit or a for-profit. So if somebody comes to me and says, I'm not sure if I want to do a for-profit or a nonprofit, but I want to rely on charitable donations, well, you probably need to be a nonprofit. That's why I have that on the right end of the column here, right? That's the only kind of organization that can get charitable donations. If you tell me that, well, in order to launch my business, I'm really going to need people to invest, right? Equity investors, people to be co-owners with it. Well, I told you earlier, nonprofits don't have owners. So that means you need a for-profit. And then there's a lot of stuff that's kind of in the middle. There's a lot of different kinds of income. I'll touch on a few of them here. Selling inventory. It's usually more of a for-profit activity unless the inventory you're selling is being done in a related way, right? It's related inventory. It's I guess textbooks, maybe in some contexts if you're operating differently than a for-profit textbook publisher. Are you making your money from loaning money? Well, that could be a nonprofit activity if you're prioritizing certain kinds of people for those loans and subsidizing their loans with low interest rates. On the flip side, government grants. Government grants are almost always going to go to charities, that's not always true, right? Sometimes grants will go to other organizations. Contracts may be more open to both for-profits and nonprofits. So when you think about this sort of for-profit, nonprofit question, do you want a for-profit affiliate for your nonprofit? What kind of activities do you want to take on as a nonprofit? you can think about sort of the different types of income and where they fit in and what's appropriate. A lot of this framework comes from this next slide. There's been some UBIT questions. I think we'll probably answer at least a little bit of them here. I would divide the world into related business activities and unrelated activities. Starting with what's related. Well, things are related. Let me see if I can do legal jargon from the top of my head. Is something is related if it has a significant causal connection to the achievement of your charitable purposes. So causal connection. So, you know, let's say you're an aquarium and you're selling, you know, keychains with pictures of fish on them. This is a real example from a case, and I believe there's some version of that that's related and some version that's unrelated. Are you educating people about fish with your keychain? Great. Are you just selling a keychain that's just a bottle opener and it's got nothing else on it? That is not a related activity. You're not achieving your charitable purpose. Some organizations take more aggressive positions on this and other things, but if you're doing business activities to generate money, start with the question, are they related? Is this actually helping us achieve our charitable purpose, or does it just have our name on it? If it just has our name on it, I'm not sure that's helping you achieve your charitable purpose. There are special rules for different kinds of things. This is a very complicated area of the law, but think about related, think about it as achieving mission, not just, you know, is it, you know, can you make an argument? Unrelated business activities, the kind of things that generate UBIT, are trades or businesses. Those are active businesses that are regularly carried on. So something you do once a year is probably not a regularly carried on business, or something you do once but never again is probably not a regularly carried on business. So you're probably safe. But if you're doing something regularly, or if it's a seasonal activity, you do it every summer for the whole summer, that could be a regularly carried on business that would generate UBIT. If you have UBIT, it's not the end of the world. You pay. If you have unrelated business income, you just pay unrelated business income tax. That tax is at the regular corporate rate, which federally is 21%, and in California, I think is 13-ish%. So you will pay some tax on it. If it's a little bit of income, look, it's better to have 79 cents than it is to have 0 cents. So maybe it's good, but just got to factor it in. At some point, if it becomes a substantial activity, that could jeopardize your exemption. Like Patrick said, you don't want to lose that exempt status. It's the thing you have as a nonprofit that makes you special. So if 80% of your income is nothing but the gas station that you run, you could lose your exempt status in addition to paying tax on that income. And there are so many exclusions and modifications that we could talk for 2 hours about UBIT and everyone would hate it. But I can at least boil it down to this chart. So this chart kind of covers what you need to know about UBIT. So what's the name of this chart? It's the thing you do with like the thing with like jeans. I forget what they call this kind of chart. Not important. There's two kinds of income. There's unrelated income and there's related income. But you can see from the green, the related income is pretty much always safe. If you're doing something that's related to your exempt purpose, then you're going to be safe and not have to worry about this stuff. And so the question that came up earlier, we're renting to somebody, but we're renting it to this organization doing work that's connected to our mission. We collect some money, but maybe we're not collecting as much as we would if we were just trying to get the most we could for it. Probably going to be in the related category. Let's have a good argument. It's in the related. You have to start asking the question if it's unrelated. So at the top left corner is passive income. So passive income is generally not taxable. Rent, royalties, interest, gain, and dividends. So when you sell, your charity has a brokerage account, it sells some stock. If you personally had sold that stock, you'd pay tax, but your charity doesn't because charities don't pay tax on passive income, even if it's related. When you sell Google stock, you are not achieving your mission, but you still don't have to pay tax on it. There are some exceptions to that exception, and we've mentioned 2 out of 3 of them so far. One was debt finance income. I said if you have mortgaged property, if you mortgage property and rent it to just individual tenants, it's usually going to be taxable, or at least partly taxable. Won't bore you with why that rule exists. Same with the S corporation income rule. I don't understand why that rule exists, but there's just a rule that says if a nonprofit owns an S corp, every dollar of income from that S corp is taxable, regardless of what it is. And then payments from controlled subsidiaries. This is a complicated rule. If your nonprofit owns a for-profit sub and the for-profit pays you rent, that might be taxable. But leaving that aside, that is usually a safe category. Passive income is usually safe. The opposite, usually taxable, is the bottom left. That's active income that's unrelated to your activity. So that could be selling stuff that's not related to your mission. If you have a very large bake sale that you're conducting constantly. It can include if you own a partnership interest in something that could result in UBIT. There are some exceptions. There's a volunteer exception. There's activities not regularly carried on. It's a very long code section, so there's many things we could talk about. But just know if you're doing something, one sort of bottom line rule is if you're doing something the way a for-profit would do something to try to make money, you should ask yourself, why aren't you? If you're in competition with for-profits, why aren't you paying tax on that? You might have to, you might not have to, but it's worth asking the question. That's my last thing on UBIT. I have one more slide where I will just talk about a couple different fundraising topics since we're
Carl,
talking about
while we
money.
have a break,
Oh, yeah.
there was one question, and maybe very specific. At what point does a business have to take out a business license when first starting up? So, I think it'd really depend where you are, but I think Karl can fill you in on the California aspect of that.
Yeah, I can. And of course, it's even more specific than state. It's really city by city. Some cases, county by county. What I would say is, once you have a physical place of business, there is a place you are doing business from that you list publicly as your address. If I were you, I would register with the city where you are in. If it's LA, San Francisco, Oakland, it's usually not a large sum of money. There is, generally speaking, no nonprofit exception for registering. Maybe some cities do. I don't know. I know San Francisco does it. I know LA doesn't. I would just assume, generally speaking, that if you have a place of business, you should go and register. It's not usually much more complicated than just saying, hey, we exist in your city and here's your $35, $50, $70, whatever it is. Usually that's something you can do yourself. You don't really need a lawyer for it, unless you really want to set some money on fire. You don't need to hire a lawyer to do it. Just go to the city or county website, work your way through the forms. It's usually not that hard, but it is good to do. Yeah, I don't, there's a lot of non-compliance on this one, but it's better to have done it than have them follow up with you later.
Can I jump in for a second? I want to get back to your last, the pretty slide you have. This one, unrelated business income for a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
And because I want to stick on the topic of nonprofits for this, because that's what this session is about. But so you said something about, a bake sale or, some of the other things that nonprofits do to raise money. And that's a little confusing to me. It may be to other people, because nonprofits have a lot of trouble getting, unrestricted income. And so often they have to take desperate measures to raise unrestricted income, sometimes even having cute little kids selling cookies and things. And that becomes unrestricted income, because if you try to actually have an event, as you well know, you can end up losing more money than you actually gain. So I just want you to kind of say a little bit more about that kind of fundraising.
Yeah, no, and as soon as I said the bake sale exception, I qualified it because bake sale is actually probably a safe example. So why isn't a bake sale a related business income? Well, it's not because it's related, because there's probably not a lot of educational information on the cookies or brownies. So I'm sure someone has tried that too. But it's probably because it's a bake sale. It's not a bakery. Hey guys,
that's a good idea. Literacy cookies.
If your nonprofit had a bakery that ran all the time, I would say that's a regularly conducted business and probably wouldn't need to pay tax. But a bake sale It's not something that is usually not regularly carried on. It is not a year-long activity. It is not just sort of happening constantly. It is something you do a few times a year, raise some money. I think most organizations that are doing that stuff would take the position, this isn't a regularly carried on business. We don't have a bake sale business. We did a bake sale, you know, and if it's going to be something you do year round, like I've had clients that want to operate in, like we have a full bakery. This is a year-round catering business. Year-round catering business, I'm going to tell you, is probably unrelated business income and taxable. I have seen people make arguments like, well, we incorporate our job training program into our catering business. There's ways to do that correctly. There's ways to do that incorrectly.
Delancey
But
Street,
Delancey Street is a great example. That's a related business activity because it's part of the rehabilitation program. Goodwill, a Goodwill store, selling donated goods and doing so to distributing charities is generally going to be an unrelated business income. It's not going to be not unrelated business. It's going to be safe. Right? It's going to be good kinds of income. So there's different exceptions for different kinds of things. But and there's also I believe Goodwill relies on the exception for selling donated goods. Some of these exceptions were clearly written for particular organizations, by the way. But so that's an example of one that was so safe. So there's lots of ways that are safe. And I think like going back to the lobbying, you can think about this the same way you think about the lobbying side. Don't take the fact that there are rules as a reason not to do things that would be good for your organization, but do think about how could I structure it so either my income from this is passive, or maybe it's related, my picture on the cookie idea, or maybe we can use the volunteer exception because we're just going to have our volunteers do it, and that's always safe for good. You could have I guess theoretically have a volunteer gas station. Probably wouldn't be a very good gas station, but you could do it. Have a volunteer guy, you know, that could be a way to do it. It's not regularly carried on. We just do a little bit. So like there are ways to get out of it, but it's what you would rather do is plan ahead and know here's why we're not going to pay tax on this, then do it and find out later that you have to give up some of the money you just made, right? So that would be my recommendation. So approach it with a positive mindset to generate unrestricted money, but just be careful because there are ways to go wrong.
Thank you.
I will get to my last slide, and then we'll open up for questions. I'm just going to share a couple of thoughts on these 4 random topics. One, Carmen raised this when she brought up unrestricted money. The charitable trust doctrine is about restricted money. All of your money is restricted in a sense because you are a nonprofit with certain charitable purposes, and when people give to you, you have to use it for 501c3 purposes, as well as anything you put in your articles. So all your money is kind of restricted, but usually when we say unrestricted money, we mean nothing special. That's because donors can create restrictions on the money they give you that you can only use for certain things. So for example, only use, if someone gives you money and says, only use this for your animal shelter, you can't use that money to go open an art museum and vice versa. It is difficult to change those restrictions unless the donor lets you out of them. So there's 2 lessons here. If you have restricted money, make sure you use it restrictedly in the way the restricted purpose requires. 2, when you're raising money, try not to raise it in a restricted fashion. You can create a restriction in 2 ways. Either the donor gives to you and says you have to use it for this purpose, or you could say, hey, we're fundraising for this purpose. Any money that people give you in response to that is restricted. So be careful what your mailers say. Be careful what your capital campaign says because you're raising for a restricted purpose. Also be careful what your articles say, to go back to something very, very early on. Your articles don't need to be narrow, but often they are. And just pro tip, if you did your articles on LegalZoom, I often find that those are almost always too narrowly restricted because they ask you to fill in a really specific word, and then you can only do this kind of activity on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. It's not what you want. You want flexibility. Charitable solicitation registration laws. If you are raising money out of state, then you may need to register with the Attorney General of their state. What does going into a particular state mean nowadays, where you're just doing everything on Zoom? I don't know. But at some point you've crossed the line. And so if you're getting a lot of money from another state, consider registering in that state. That's an oversimplified way to say you at least have to think about it when you start
And
getting money from
one thing
outside.
I'll add, Carl, is I mentioned this earlier. If you're soliciting in New York or Pennsylvania, you probably want to be registered there, because those attorney generals are in California are by far the most aggressive attorney generals when it comes to charitable solicitation laws.
That's a great call out. I agree. Those are the top three. Commercial co-venture. We could talk about this for a long time, but we won't. Just know that when somebody comes to you with that idea is, hey, and they're marketing their product, says for every $10 we sell, we're going to donate $1 to this charity or that charity or this. That is actually a highly regulated transaction, and is something that in 20-ish states there's a registration process for the company that's doing it. And in California, that you either need to register or have a very specific kind of agreement. So sometimes people have these good ideas and then they find out there are these rules. They're like, well, there shouldn't be all those rules. That's not fair. I would say think about the counter of it. There are these rules exist to protect against people using your charity's name to sell a bunch of stuff and then not actually give you any money, right? So rules exist to protect you from that. It does mean that if somebody comes to you with that idea, you should tell them there are rules. Speaking of rules, raffles are almost always illegal, and somehow they happen anyway. They're in what I tell people is, in California, it is possible to do a raffle, but only if you register with the Attorney General, and I believe it's once a year. There are things that are not raffles. So if you don't need to pay for a ticket to participate, that's not a raffle. If it's a contest of skill, that's not a raffle. But if you're doing a real raffle, 50-50, those are generally illegal gambling. And so, the lawyer answer is don't do them, and know that there are, in fact, although there's a lot of people not complying and getting away with it, there are occasionally some crackdowns on it. So understand that raffles are generally gambling unless you've gone through the registration process. And with that, I will pivot to questions. I do see a couple. One was about the list of California filings. I think you will find those earlier in the slides, and we can come back to them later. And again, feel free to reach out. But basically, IRS, AG, Secretary of State, Franchise Tax Board all have some version of an annual filing, or in one case every other year. So that should be where you would start with your list. But yeah, if you check out the materials, you'll see a lot of stuff on that. One question that Norma asked, you're raising money for scholarships. Can you take out money for expenses for raising funds from the donations? Like an amazing question, because it is on point and it depends who you ask. You ask me, I would say, unless you're clear about it in your solicitation that we charge this fee, maybe that the money we spend on scholarships is subject to our policies, which are here. Here's a link, and the link talks about how you send a fee. That is good. I would say the default answer is no, unless you're clear that you're going to charge it ahead of time. It's all about donor intent, right? So there is, I believe this was in Ohio, with the Moritz Law School in Ohio. There was a donor who was very upset about how much the law school, he was giving, let's say, $10 million to a law school, and the law school charged, let's say, a 7% fundraising fee to cover the costs for fundraising. And the donor was like, look, I came to you. I brought you my money. Why? You didn't spend any time fundraising on this. Why do you get to charge 7% of my donation? So this can really come up. I spend a lot of time with a lot of organizations on questions like this. If you want to charge that fee, then I would make that clear that's part of your policy. Otherwise, it's got to be something tangibly connected to scholarships. I do think paying someone to review scholarship applications could count, unless the donor is really clear that it's just for the actual scholarship itself. Little nuanced questions like that come up in the charitable trust context. It's part of the fun. I know we have a little bit of time, maybe not that much time at all. Maybe time for another question or so before we hand it off back to Carmen.
We have time for one more question.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
You win.
Hi, thank you, gentlemen. This has been an amazing conversation. I actually have two questions, but I'm only leaning on one. Could you kind of address the other one? One is I'm a 501c3 and I've been approached by a commercial venture that wants to do not-for-profit work, which they can't do with their commercial venture. Well, they can do, but they want to enter into a fiscal sponsor relationship. What type of guardrails should I be looking at as the 501c partner in that venture?
I'll take a first pass at that, and Patrick, feel free to hit anything you think I missed. I think your first question is going to be, are we doing this as a Model A or a Model C? So a Model A would be the project is yours, and you let them run it, but they're doing it with your money on your books, right? They're sort of your contracts or your stuff. I would say Model A is generally it's safer in some sense because you, the charity, are taking responsibility for it. The other alternative would be, is it going to be a Model C, which means do they just want you to write a check so they can spend the money on stuff? So figuring out the cash flow is the first thing, and then making sure you have a good agreement that matches that cash flow.
Okay.
The other phase of stuff I would talk about with them is how are they going to do that? So one, are you comfortable that the stuff they're going to do is charitable, educational? Like this is, you're like, this fits with our mission. If we did it, we would feel good about doing it. We're okay with them doing it.
Right.
The answer to that is yes. And I would just want to make sure that the way they are doing it is not blending to the commercial side into it. So in other words, I've seen specific examples where it's just like, thanks for coming to our nonprofit educational session. Now spend the last 20 minutes with this long commercial for our for-profit stuff and its services. What I would say is you can do it. That's a good use of a fiscal sponsorship if they have an idea and they want to work with you to do their idea. But just make sure that you can both ensure charitability. Like think about you have the good stuff you need and you don't have the bad stuff. The bad stuff being, looking like marketing advertising for a particular company. You can thank them like you would thank any donor or volunteer. You could say, hey, this, they're leading the way on this. Here's their logo. But you just can't say anything about like good services, stuff like that.
Right. Making sure that they're not using the 501c3 to raise money to shore up their for-profit that they would not otherwise have access to. It'd be a clear violation.
That's right. It would be a violation if you were using you to benefit them. Now, if there's an activity that they were going to do themselves, but they want you to do it so they can spend other people's money to do it, that can be fine if it's done correctly. It's just got to be done charitably, and you can't mix in the bad stuff.
Okay, great, thank you. And then my second question was,
we're gonna have to cut off.
I didn't think Carmen would let you get away with that, but feel free to reach out.
That's my little sister. That's my little sister. She knows better. She's just being bad. But anyway, but let me just say to everyone, first of all, to you, Karl, and to you, Patrick, that was extraordinary. There are not a lot of people that can make the law that interesting to me to keep my attention for that long. And I really, really appreciate it. The other thing I want everybody to know is that I am just so appreciative of Karl because he's using his own personal time, and Patrick as well, to make sure that our nonprofit community is prepared and protected. Now, Karl, may we put your contact information in the chat so that if people have any additional questions, they can contact your office directly?
Yes, definitely. I think Shai just dropped my and Patrick's email. Feel free to reach out. And like I said before the talk started, I'm always happy to spend 30 minutes or so just talking with people and not worried about charging. So you got
now,
some.
Did you all hear that 30 minutes? Did you see how graciously he said 30 minutes?
Yeah, I think I said or so. So I might get in trouble for the or so. But yeah, if you got some questions, feel free to reach out.
But if Patrick gives you any time, you can go to Patrick, not tell Patrick after he finishes that you're also going to Karl. That gives you an hour into attorneys. How about that?
Just use the fake name. It's a great idea.
Use a fake name. So anyway, so you're going to have that information. You're also going to have the recording. But can we all just give Patrick and Karl just a hand? Just show that you appreciate it, because this was pro bono and they're expensive. And rightfully so, because they're keeping us out of trouble. So thank you again, gentlemen. It was excellent. And I personally appreciate what you do. And I know everyone else does as well. Thank you. Now,
Thanks for having us.
Shy, thank you. And I know Shy is going to be angry with me if I don't give them the opportunity to take care of the evaluation. But so please promise me, everybody, you won't just click off, but you will do the evaluation because we need it for our funding. But before we do that, I am so excited about our final session, our celebratory session, and I'm going to tell you who's coming to our celebratory session. We have Pastor Paul and Cheryl Baines. Okay, and it's St. Samuel Church. That's my typo. It's not St. Stephen's. It's St. Samuel Church of God in Christ and United Hope Builders. Then we have Dr. Jonathan Butler, who's also a pastor with Third Baptist Church. He is a social epidemiologist and a researcher and a professor at UCSF School of Medicine. And then we have my nephew, Devon Bogan, who is the founder of Advanced Peace. And one of the things he talks about is how to keep peace in our communities, talk about the gun violence, and talk about an approach that he's using that's working not just in the United States, but it's working all over the world now. We're going to hear about that. The theme of this is the power of faith and community. And we're not just talking and taking your impact higher. We're not just talking about these three amazing pastors and leaders, but we're talking about you. We want you to hear what they did, how they started, how they took this to scale, and how they made the impact. When I talk about scale, I'm not just talking about scale internationally. I mean, taking it to scale in your community, going from there into your county, going from there to your region, taking that successful thing and going into your state and then the country and then the world. Isn't that, after all, faiths, people? Isn't that the Great Commission? How do we do that? Okay, this is how do we do that? So I'm excited because it took a lot of work for me to get these three heavy hitters in one session. So have my back, have our back us up, be there, enjoy it, celebrate. This is our celebration for the end of the year. And this is going to be moderated by our very own leader, funder, Dr. Michelle Miles Chambers. So anyway, that's going to be September 27th. It is by Zoom, and it's going to be a celebration. So we want you there. Finally, please complete your evaluation. We thank you for coming today. Complete your evaluation. Once you have ended the evaluation poll, then we're going to close it off. So I'm going to say thank you and goodbye because we're going to close right after that. And we're looking forward to seeing you on September 27th for our final session for A Model Built on Faith, the Impact Series 2023. Okay. Bye, everybody, and thank you